Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jack, and in this video I spent 10 days in the Long Dark's new region, Forsaken Airfield. Honestly, this video is kinda just an excuse to get to explore the new regions and transition zones, and I probably would have spent 10 days doing so anyway, so it's not much of a challenge, but it's a bit more interesting than just jumping into Pilgrim mode and safely walking there, so I went with Classic Voyager and set off on my journey. I was a bit confused at first because on the world map there was no option to select a new region, but I looked into it and it turns out you can only reach it by actually traveling there. The Broken Railroad region is the closest spawn point, so that's where I decided to start. I know we're all here to see the new locations, so I won't spend too much time on my days in Broken Railroad, don't worry. I spawned in at night, which wasn't ideal, and the weather wasn't the best, but it could always be worse in this game. I had a look around to get a sense of my location, and I figured out I was at the bottom of the mountain where the hunting lodge sits, and that seemed like a much safer bet than running through the forest in the night to the maintenance shed with my temperature rapidly dropping, so I started my trek up the mountain. When I arrived at the cabin, it was pitch black inside. I blindly stumbled around looking for items because I didn't have any source of light aside from matches, which I didn't want to waste, but I did end up lighting one just to have a super quick look around, though it didn't help much. So instead I made a fire in the fireplace, taking a torch from it and exploring the cabin while I let snow boil into water. There wasn't a ton of stuff, but after playing an exclusively Interloper for most this year, it felt like more than enough. I got myself dressed in pretty decent clothing, repairing some as well, then headed out as the sun rose. I checked out the cars in front of the house, flipping down the visors out of habit, and actually found notes and keys behind some. It was a small detail, but something I was pretty happy about with this update. I feel so seen as someone who without fail always checks the visors. There are also a couple new things you can craft and more to come, I believe, as well as item variations, which is pretty fun. I deployed a mountaineering rope I had found in the basement and rappelled my way down the cliffside, crossing the river and keeping an eye out for wolves as I made my way to the maintenance yard. I went inside the garage and searched the whole thing, getting a bunch of good loot, then went to the sleeping area to sort out my bag, repair more clothes, read, and spend the night. An aurora woke me from my sleep, and after collecting a buffer memory from the computer, I let myself enjoy it for a bit. They never fail to stun me with their beautiful eeriness in this game. I found another note behind a visor in a truck, then paused when I heard a wolf howl. I tried to sneak around it because it was standing between me and the exit, but when it howled again, I chickened out. Interloper has made me way too jumpy. I'm pretty sure it wasn't even howling at me. Regardless, I crossed through the garage again to head out in the same direction, just a different path, napping for an hour before continuing on. I spotted the broken down bridge from the side of the mountain, and assumed that would be the place to go to cross over into the first transition zone, so I walked over there, looting a train car on the way. Then I got to deal with my lovely fear of heights, white-knuckling my mouse and keyboard as I precariously tiptoed along the rails on the bridge, daring a glance down at the ravine before entering a train tunnel that took me out of the broken railroad and into the brand new far-range branch line transition zone. That is a mouthful and a half. The tunnel was extremely dark, but I wasn't sure how long it would last, so I didn't want to use my lantern until I absolutely had to. I wandered past train derailments and partial tunnel collapses until I came up to a door with a restricted area sign beside it. The noises that began when I stepped inside were so unsettling, endless creaks and water drips echoing off the walls. I found a room a ways into the tunnel and managed to loot it all in the dark, although now that I know I didn't have to use my lantern much, I wish I would have just so we could have seen it better, but oh well. I continued down the tunnel until it was finally too dark to see my feet, and then I did at last bring out my light. There was a door at the end of the tunnel that required a key, which I guess I had luckily found at some point, probably behind one of the visors, or maybe I used my pry bar to force it open based on the noise, I'm not sure. Either way, I was in, and I saw the light at the end of the tunnel, quite literally. But there was still another direction I hadn't explored, so I turned back around and walked until I found an open door with an exit sign above it. This direction looked much more exciting, with a long set of stairs leading down to another door that at last took me outside to a small platform with a nice view of a waterfall. I started to walk down a tree bridge that led into a frozen ravine, and saw that there was another bridge above it, which is where I'm guessing the first exit door led, but I didn't want to walk all the way back up, and the route I was on looked more scenic, so I kept going. I had to use branches to climb down two ledges, and then followed the river for a while until I entered a cave, apparently named the Plate Layers Shortcut. With how long the cave stretched on for, it didn't feel like much of a shortcut, but I always enjoy exploring them, and as with all the other caves in this game, it looked so stunning, so I didn't mind. I stepped out of the cave into what was somehow still the far-range branch line. This has to be the largest transition zone in the game. I followed the rails until I came to another tree bridge and a location called the Founder Track, but it was a dead end with a view of a train car, so I turned back and went the other direction. This route led me along the tracks for ages, to a bridge with a view of a river, then eventually to a more open area that greeted me with the sound of a wolf howling in the distance and another derailment. I walked up a hill and found a cave where I decided to settle down for the evening because my energy was low and it was going to be night soon anyway, so I repaired more clothes, read, and slept there for the night after watching a pretty sunset. When I woke up, it was super cold, and I thought maybe it was just an early morning thing in this region, so I stayed in to read a bit more, but I later found out that nope, that's very normal, the weather in the new regions is just aggressive as shit. At least the super loud wind had stopped when I headed back out, but I was spotted by the wolf I had heard the previous night, and thanks to surviving much more terrifying terrifying situations in Interloper, I was able to deal with it a lot more calmly than I would have at the beginning of this year, even when I messed up my flare throw and had to get uncomfortably close to the wolf to pick it back up and try again. That time I scared it off long enough to run past, and then I just had to deal with it slowly stalking me all the way through the ravine until it got distracted by some rabbits at a bridge. Lucky me, not so lucky rabbits. Then I was again running through a long tunnel into what I presumed was a mine, my flare's red glare flickering on the rock walls and lighting the way. There was a much more open area due to a huge collapse before I was plunged back into darkness, eventually making my way out to the other side and entering yet another new transitional region, the transfer pass. I walked around a bunch of crashed flat cars and went up to a small overlook to get a view of the region, but there wasn't much to see aside from a frozen river, at least not until I returned to the rails and caught sight of what looked like a little mining camp in the distance. When I got closer, I discovered it was called the Vacant Depot, and walked up some steps to this little tower where I found a jerry can and some arrows, albeit broken ones, then looted some trucks nearby, where in the trunk of one I actually found an intact arrow. The building there had a train schedule on the wall, with a piece of paper taped over it stating no more trains. The inside of the building looked like a sitting area to what was evidently a train station, with a ticket booth and abandoned suitcases scattered around. I took some water from the bathroom because I was getting low, then went to check out the other structure there. I had to take a winding road around a large concrete wall to get there, climbing up into a metal chute that took me up a long wooden tunnel, soot and ash lining the floor. There wasn't much inside, but it was still a super cool building, very unique to the game. I spent the night there, breaking things down and organizing my bag. I walked back down the chute in the morning and exited through a side door, deciding to check out the road behind the buildings before continuing to follow the rails. The weather wasn't great, but I didn't want to waste precious daylight, so I dealt with the cold and hoped it wouldn't turn into a full-on blizzard. Eventually I found a sign that pointed me in two directions, one of which would lead to the Langston mine, the other of which would lead to Field 31. The latter sounded much more promising because I assumed it was the name of the airfield we're all here for, so I went that way, not bothering to turn back around and check if the rails led anywhere else. I followed the road for so long before I was able to leave the transfer pass, finally entering the forsaken airfield region, the moment we've all been waiting for. The weather here was even worse, the cold biting through to my skin despite my decently good clothing. I can't even imagine how difficult Interloper would be in this region. Maybe a good future challenge idea. I followed the road for what felt like forever, a truck being the only thing to break up the emptiness for ages. Then at last, the airfield loomed in the distance, and I ran to a crumbling roadside to get a better look. This region looked vast, and only seemed to get bigger the further I walked into it. I had to stop in a cave to rest for a bit, then continued on, stopping to look out at the sprawling landscape every chance I had. I eagerly jogged across a tree bridge, wobbling precariously in my excitement to get down to the main attraction. I had no idea though how far that road would stretch on for. It took me most of the day before I spotted my first structure, a small trailer in what was named the Junker's Paddock. I found a Polaroid in a truck there and a journal page, then looted the inside of the trailer before repairing some clothes, reading, and sleeping. I got an early start and continued along the road in worsening weather, running the whole morning until I came across a fork in the road and a sign with an airplane symbol on it that pointed me in the direction I needed to go. I sprinted to the safety of a truck when I heard a wolf bark at me, but I only sat there for a second because my temperature was still dropping inside. I crouched until I made it past the wolf, glad to not have to waste a flare, although really I'm pretty sure with lone wolves I could just keep running while they slowly stalked me, which is what I did with this one when it spotted me the moment I got impatient with my crouching and jumped up to run. It followed me at a distance the whole way until I eventually made it to Field 31 and hopped inside a truck, which made it lose interest in me. There was a little empty shed next to the truck and then a ton of big structures around the field. I entered one with double doors, and I think it's so cool that some of the buildings weren't fully indoor locations, so you could just step in without a loading screen. The building was the terminal, and it had suitcases and travel posters strewn around the waiting room as well as a storage area and a bathroom. And then I found out I was able to actually enter the aircraft as I would with any other vehicle, and I was so excited. The interiors were so cool, with searchable lockers between the seats, and being able to sit in the front and search the side hatches was awesome too. I went around looting the helicopters and planes, although I was trying to be quick about it because I was freezing and at risk of hypothermia. There was a lot of loot in the shed, and my bag was pretty heavy by the time I entered the main hangar. It felt like I could almost feel the crisp air inside and smell the rusting metal and cold concrete. It was such a sick building. I walked around the outside of the giant room, stepping into small side rooms and looting them. There was some sort of classroom or training room with a bunch of equipment and diagrams, and some good-ass items lying around the whole building. I found another note on the floor in an office upstairs, and got a good view of the hangar from the catwalk up there. I collected water from the bathroom and found a whole rabbit carcass in one of the showers. Not sure how that got there, but rest in peace. I got some food from the kitchen, then headed back down to drop a bunch of my stuff on the floor before making my way down some stairs into the basement. I found an extremely suspicious memo on a desk inside, warning employees about keeping to themselves and not asking questions in a concerningly cheerful tone, filling in some parts of Great Bear's story, but mostly raising more questions. There was a workbench in the basement as well as a forge, which was great because it's a super safe location to spend time crafting with either of those. I went back upstairs to the main room to read and then slept there for the night. I went out early again and explored the rest of the airfield, checking out a shed on the edge of it that held my first hatchet of the run, then ran over to the control tower, finding some food and a heavy hammer in the small room on the left. The main room was a messy office, control panels lining the walls, and wires and papers scattered around the floor. The upstairs had a great vantage point to look over the field, although it probably looks nicer when the weather is clearer than it was that morning. There was a bloody note written by someone who seemed to have been driven crazy by the auroras, or perhaps the glimmer fog, a new weather phenomenon brought on by the auroras that causes insomnia and brings power to electronics. After I had looked around the whole Airfield, I decided to keep following the road and see where it took me. I found the Cargo Master's trailer, which was insanely full of good loot. Fishing tackles, a quality toolkit, lots of food including an MRE, and some good pants. There was another note in one of the lockers from someone who I assume worked at this place, or who was maybe even undercover trying to figure out if there was any suspicious activity going on at the field. I exited the trailer and continued on the road, finding an underwhelming shed with no loot, and then walked down a slope to cross a frozen river, making my way across the snowy plains onto Shoulder Lake. The area was crawling with wolves, so I was very watchful, keeping track of where they were as I ran across the ice. I found a corpse next to a plane crash, a research book ironically on surviving the wilderness sitting just out of reach of their hand. I was able to enter the plane to escape the blistering winds for a moment, then back out I went, running across the crackling surface to what looked like a fishing hut in the distance. I got distracted though by a winding set of wooden steps in the cove to my right, and wandered over there instead, finding a second hatchet lodged into a boat to the side of the dock. The stairs led me to this strange cave tunnel, and on the other side up some more stairs was an island cottage. This has to be one of my favorite buildings in the game now. Even in the winter storm, it was so cozy, and I envy whoever lived there before everything went to shit. The cottage had lots of food, but more importantly, a bow and arrows. I already had one bow, and I sure don't remember when I acquired it, but this one was in better condition, so I was happy about the find. There was a little water storage container under the sink, such a cool detail, and a beautiful Polaroid taken from some high viewpoint during an aurora. I braved out the storm there for the rest of the evening, reading until the sun began to set, and I stepped out to admire the view. I woke up only a few hours after going to bed to find an aurora had begun, and seeing the lights of the airfield so far off in the distance was magical. It gave me goosebumps in that eerie, isolating way the game so often does. I looked around to see if I could see lights of any other possible structures in the distance, but I didn't find any, so I enjoyed the colors for a bit instead before going back to sleep. I organized my bag in the morning and then was greeted with more icy cold when I stepped outside, which I had now accepted was the average weather for this region, and crawled back through the tunnel cave, taking the stairs back down to the lake. When I started to walk over to the fishing hut I had seen the day before, I saw I was absolutely surrounded by wolves, and I felt like whatever possible loot it held wasn't worth dealing with that, so I decided to move along. There would always be other runs to check it out. I crossed the lake and made my way towards some circling birds, finding a corpse next to a burnt out fire, no supplies on them. I also spotted a hunter's blind more towards the direction of the airfield and found my first hunting knife of the run inside, then continued on heading away from the airfield since I obviously didn't want to go back the way I'd come from already. After walking across endless plains of snow and starting to wonder if it was possible to get snow blindness through a screen, I found a clump of broken up trees and below them a crashed helicopter at a location called the Final Approach, which sounded quite ominous. There was a corpse outside and an empty flare kit inside, but other than a unique interior, there wasn't much around. I wasn't sure where to go after that, so I ran across the fields until I reconnected with the road, but I didn't see any structures around and I was getting worryingly cold and tired, so I decided it was probably safest to head back to the airfield before I got hypothermia or passed out from exhaustion. That felt like the longest, slowest walk of my life, although I did find a broken down cabin on the way to break up the endless blinding light. I ended up chugging an energy drink to get me through the last stretch and was able to make it to the terminal and rest just as my vision started doubling. After a short nap, I ate and hydrated, then promptly passed out for the night. In the morning, I organized my bag once again, then headed in the direction of the last area I hadn't explored. It seemed to just be an open mountainous area, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing any structures. It felt like maybe a cave could be around with the way the path was taking me up, but I instead found two branch-covered ledges to climb up and made it to the location the Polaroid of the airfield and the aurora had been taken at. It was still a stunning view, but I wish I had been there when the aurora had happened the night I was at the cottage. I followed the trail under some rocky overhangs, down a frozen river, and across some snowy boulders, and after climbing down some more ledges, I reached a tree bridge and realized I had found a path that led me back to the way I'd entered the region. Accidentally coming full circle like that was pretty cool. I napped in a truck after running along the road for a while and woke up to glimmer fog for the first time. Despite being bad news, it was really beautiful in a freaky way, but I had to get going and run from it. Until I was in a proper shelter, my risk of insomnia would only go up until I was eventually unable to sleep at all, and as far as I knew, the closest shelter was the trailer in that paddock, which was a painfully long run, but it was my only choice. I turned around and began the long run back down the road, watching the snow crackle with electricity, such a strange sight. I was so distracted by it that I came so close to falling to my death on the crumbling section of road. My stomach fell through the floor. I was so lucky I noticed in time. After that terrifying experience, I ventured on a bit more carefully, although still as fast as I could in my attempts to outrun the fog and its insomnia affliction. My energy was dropping super low and I was still dangerously far from the trailer, but all I could do was keep moving. There was no other way to escape it. I ended up drinking another energy drink just to boost me for that last sprint because my insomnia risk was getting way too high, and as soon as I entered the trailer, I breathed a sigh of relief. All my afflictions immediately healed. I was able to rest and actually take in how cool the trailer looked with the power being affected by the fog, admiring the glow before settling into sleep. About halfway through the night though, I woke up to the sound of buzzing and droning hums, and I was so excited. I had hoped I'd get to see the airfield during an aurora at some point, but as it was the last day of my 10 days, I figured it wasn't going to happen, so this timing was perfect. I instantly left the trailer to start my trek because it was going to take a long time to get back to the airfield, and I wanted to make sure I made it before the aurora ended. I kept a marine flare out because I know now that wildlife is more dangerous during auroras, and I wasn't taking any chances on my last night regardless of what game mode I was in. I made it back to the truck the wolf had stalked me from earlier, earlier, but there wasn't any sign of it luckily, and I was able to continue along the stretch of road unbothered. Rounding the corner and seeing those lights in the distance was majestic. Sometimes I don't understand how this game can possibly be this beautiful. I took my time walking into the airfield, taking everything in, stunned by the feeling of beauty and isolation and hopelessness that the Aurora always brings all at once. I went inside all the buildings again once more to experience them with the lights on. The top room of the control tower was bonkers. All the panels lit up and beeping, and the view of all the lights was amazing. The terminal was so cool as well, and out of all the buildings for some reason felt the most eerie and abandoned under the flickering lights. I realized the control panels in the aircraft lit up as well, which was so insanely sick, I just couldn't get over it. And the hangar was wild. A sea of endless flickering lights on the ceiling, beeps and ticks coming from inside the aircraft, the computers emitting almost painful buzzing from the smaller rooms. The building looked incredible from the catwalk as well, the purple light coming through the giant windows adding to the unreal glow on everything. I gave it all one more look before going to sleep for the last night. I woke up in the morning, and just like that, the Aurora was gone, and it felt like the unsettling light show had never happened. I went outside to look at the airfield one last time, and then said my farewells. So there it is, 10 days in Forsaken Airfield, sorta, if you include the first few days of unavoidable travel. But really, this was just an excuse to make a video on this new region because I was so excited for it, and I'm really looking forward to all the future updates and additions to the expansion pack. Let me know if you're thinking of buying it or not, and why. I went for it right away because I spent so much time in this game and have played it for so many years that it's definitely worth it for me, and it'll improve my experience in-game, but I'm curious about other people's thoughts on this new content. Thank you so much as always for watching, and for your patience with my 100-day videos, or just videos in general. This year has been super busy, but I'm really hoping to have time to be more consistent with uploads in this coming year. No promises, but that's the goal. I know my 100 days in Interloper video has been in the works for months, and I've said soon a bajillion times, but it's really finally almost done, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested. Thank you so much for everything, I hope you're having a great end of the year, and until next time, all the love, and I'll see you soon.